and it's a pleasure to be here once again. This is, I think, one of the highlights of the academic calendar for all Central Asia buffs and Eurasia buffs, and so it's a true pleasure to be here and be here on this distinguished panel. This year I wanted to focus on developments in the Russia-China relationship, but place them within the context of this greater Eurasia concept that is now being floated in Russian official and academic and policy-making circles. And so talk about greater Eurasian integration, does it resolve Russian-Chinese types of interactions and tensions in Eurasia and especially Central Asia, and what might we expect in terms of some of the salient issues that are out there yet. So I don't have a lot of answers. I have more questions than answers, but maybe you can help think through some of these issues with us. So the concept was floated by President Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in 2016, and the Greater Eurasia represents a common space between Europe, Russia, and Asia, where Russia could play the role of a center for integration between a rising Asia and a Europe, right? So it's this idea that the Eurasian landmass itself could become this geopolitical bloc between Europe and between Asia. And then you might say, well, how is this different than what Russia has advocated in the past? I see the main difference as scaling up, right, to Eurasia as a whole, as opposed to Russian-controlled regional architectures, or Russian-led regional architectures, right? So we went through this period through which Russia was, and still is to a certain degree, pushing Russian-led blocs such as the CSTO in security and the Eurasian Economic Union in economics as being the main vehicles for promoting regional integration, right? And so for me, looking at sort of a greater Eurasia and its open adoption accomplishes sort of three things at the moment, right? So for Russia, it continues to provide a concept to hedge against the West, right? And against the EU and NATO. So it's positing a concept to then be in a position of geopolitical and geoeconomic strength. Second, and perhaps most importantly, to me, this is an actual official acceptance of China's asymmetric economic power, right? For a while, we toyed with the idea that, we could have tough negotiations between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road, that there could be mutual concessions on side, that we could sort of integrate the two. But actually, to me, this is sort of Moscow's deferral that it is willing to accept the Belt and Road as if it were in Russia's interest, right? And I think this is a key point, sort of conceptually. And then third, a greater Eurasia concept is very consistent with Moscow's promotion, this idea of a post-Western global governance, right? Of changing international order, promoting non-Western regional security and economic institutions, such as the SCO, EAU, and so forth. So greater Eurasia concept kind of really does those three things. Just in terms of kind of the chart I always chart out at presentations here, that you see China is in blue, Russia is in red. These are volumes of trade with Central Asia. So China surpasses Russia as the region's main trading partner in the great financial crisis. It really peaks in 2012, 2013, and then afterwards you see both Chinese and Russian trade fall off, and that's more of a function of regional economic crisis, devaluation, and a lot of sort of headwinds. But nevertheless, you see that massive gap that's open between China and Russia. In a sense, this is sort of Russia's acknowledgement of China's economic position. And then, of course, different kinds of Belt and Road maps that show the overall integration of the region within sort of, China's designs, Eurasian pipelines and infrastructure projects, including the recommencement now of Line D of the Central Asia-China pipeline that will then go into Tajikistan China will now connect a gas grid across all of the Central Asian countries. And then railways and corridors are being discussed too. So all this sort of connectivity. The China-Pakistan economic corridor, initially 46 billion, now the estimate's gone up to 62 billion to commit energy and infrastructure projects. And then these are some of the architectures that I've been talking about. That's the logo of the Eurasian Economic Union, the AIB, with which Russia joined, actually did an about turn after the Ministry of Finance initially rejected it, then joined on the Kremlin's directives. Belt and Road Forum, and then the SCO. And interestingly enough, the SCO now is an expanded SCO with China and India in there too. So part of the analytical challenge here is this geopolitical division of labor in Central Asia that both Beijing and Moscow talk about, is it sustainable in a greater Eurasia kind of concept? And the division of labor is that China is said to do the economics and investment, and Russia provides the security and the politics, right? And that the two are perfectly compatible, there's no tension. Any kind of talk of tension is actual sort of Western propaganda. And what I want to explore in my remaining time is this question of, can China's role, just as an investor, just as an economic partner, be bound within this greater Eurasia framework? I'm actually very skeptical, right? Sort of for three reasons. I think the political and economic tensions that are going to be caused by the Belt and Road, China's growing role as a holder of regional debt, and its political implications of that, and then what I see is sort of China's growing security footprint and interest in the region. So let's just spend a little more time on each of those. So the political challenges of the BRI. So I've talked about this in other contexts, but the Belt and Road sort of rests on this assumption, which is almost axiomatic in Chinese thinking, that spending on infrastructure leads to economic development, which in turn, economic development fosters political stability, right? That's the calculus, that's the equation, and also behind certain patterns in Xinjiang and so forth. And the question is what, right? That might actually be true in certain regions, in certain decades, in certain contexts, but you could also analytically tell a story of why you expect large investments in infrastructure projects to produce distributional conflicts, to solidify in-group patronage networks, to exacerbate ethnic tensions, right, where one ethnic group is perceived to be the primary beneficiary over the other. And in fact, you've seen a number of political flashpoints around the world surrounding Chinese investment, places like Tajikistan and Pakistan, northern Myanmar, not to mention parts of Xinjiang itself. So it's not at all clear that sort of political stability is the outcome out of all of this connectivity. And in fact, we have an interesting sort of test case at the moment, sort of Kyrgyz reactions to the proposed Chinese-Uzbekistan railway, right, which initially was going to go across southern Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyz were really concerned about this and that it would sort of maybe inflame ethnic tensions or fuel what they consider to be separatist sentiments amongst the South and Uzbekistan. So then they said that they wouldn't have us stop in Kyrgyzstan. And the counter proposal was, take the railway and go up further north. Well, of course, that didn't make sense in terms of where the Chinese wanted the railway to get to. So the point being that infrastructure is actually never apolitical, right? And I'm not sure how we got to this idea that somehow connectivity is just connectivity. That's never been the case, right? If you go back and read the political economy development of the 70s when we look at things like, dams and infrastructure and so forth, there's huge sort of political economy aspects to this. Now, this doesn't mean it's not going to get resolved, it doesn't mean there's benefits, but certainly the sort of social divisions that are likely to be fed are there. Let's talk a little bit about debt and influence in the Belt and Road. There was this prevailing idea out there that China doesn't do conditionality, right, the way sort of Western IFIs do, right? China doesn't demand macroeconomic changes or human rights criteria or political conditions. But that's always not quite been the case in the sense there's implicit conditions, right, regarding issues of Chinese territorial integrity. And I think the sort of new kind of political science research on this is looking at the emerging links between outward Chinese economic highs, especially RMB swaps, trade levels, aids, and support for China at the UN. And we're finding more and more correlations between economic dependency on Chinese loans and investments and voting behavior. That's one strand of research. But I think the key question to ask in regards to the Central Asian context are the most dependent countries on the Belt and Road the most likely to back China's policies, and how will China manage its position as a creditor in these renegotiations? What has China done in the past, right, with highly indebted countries? And there's a number of answers here. One is it just forgives debt, right? And so this is sort of the story in Africa, sort of 3 rounds of debt cancellation throughout the 2000s. But the debt that we're talking about tends to be pretty small, right? Sort of 1.3 billion in the 2000 round, a little bit less than 4 billion in 2009. So that's sort of one strategy. But the question is, what do you do with sums like this, right? Venezuela, 56 is a nice figure from Financial Times. Ecuador, 5 billion, and actually China subsidizes Ecuador's budget. Sri Lanka, I'll talk about in a sec, Myanmar. So if you can't write that off, what do? Do you demand greater equity? Do you demand renegotiations of the terms of something that's already been agreed with? Or are there implicit demands for political support on other types of issues, right? So one really interesting case is China's relationship with Greece at the moment, and how Greece has actually tended to take a very soft line on anti-Beijing EU votes, on things like human rights committee and so forth. Greece vetoed that for the first time ever. So there's a question about what is going to happen in these cases. And we have a really interesting comparative case in Sri Lanka, sort of approaches last year, of China's industrial zone, and against the sort of leasing of a port city for 99 years as a partial debt relief package to the government that was paid off there. And so the question is, will we have same degrees of sort of social backlash, political tensions against China in Central Asia? The 3 countries I think that are most of interest, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. So Kyrgyz infrastructure, we are looking at a situation where Chinese share of Kyrgyz infrastructure over the next few years is going to be the majority, in GDP itself will go over that critical 75% level. Tajikistan wrote off a lot of debt, but now it's accumulating it again. And so part of the question, if, again, China finds itself in control of a lot of sort of Tajik debt, will it make demands, say, on territorial renegotiations, right? So one of the big memes out there was that in 2001, the Tajik parliament approved a territorial adjustment that ceded mountain territory to China, is said, in exchange for certain debt relief. And then as we were talking about in the session sort of this morning, well, we don't know how much Turkmen debt there is to China, but it's a lot. We don't know its terms. Luke, I think, will talk about this more. But again, is this debt? Is this investment? How sustainable is it? China provided $8 billion worth of loans during the Great Financial Crisis that were to be repaid with gas deliveries. It's not at all clear that Turkmenistan is fulfilling those obligations. So what does China do vis-a-vis Ashgabat? And then finally, China's growing security interests. And this is, to me, sort of really kind of challenges this narrative that China's not interested in security, it doesn't do security. For the most part, in the 2000s, China's security interests coexisted with Russia's because they were interested in very different things, right? Russia was especially interested in sort of being the symbolic provider of security in the region, right? Having military bases with flags, openly pushing against the Western military presence and against sort of, Western political influence. And China focused mostly on the Xinjiang issue, right? And especially on Uyghur groups and clamping down on these sort of transnational incursions and border problems and so forth, mainly through the SCO. I think that's changing. I'm not sure that was actually ever the case, but it's changing in a couple ways. One, last September, we had a suicide bombing in Bishkek of the Chinese embassy, right, which took the question of regional security at a whole different level and dimension, and also initiate an investigation amongst Chinese authorities with Kyrgyz authorities on what happened there. And now what we're seeing is a more and more active interest of China having an actual regional military presence in this ring. And there's sort of an interesting convergence here of reported Chinese military activity with 3 partners in Greater Eurasia. One is in Afghanistan, right? So you might have been following these sort of reports, sort of Afghan officials going on the record with rumors of a negotiation between China and Afghanistan over constructing a military facility in the Wakhan corridor, right? That China would be able to use. Sort of Chinese officials have denied it, but a number of Afghan sort of sources said that those talks are in advanced stage. Then we have reports of China's cooperation with Tajikistan in constructing and upgrading border posts and this sort of training centers in the region. And regardless of sort of the status of this, the point is to get through the Wakhan corridor, China's going to have access through Tajikistan too, right? So the question of sort of Chinese access in Tajikistan is paramount, both in terms of Afghanistan, but also separately on these border issues too. And then finally, we've had the recent acknowledgement by Chinese officials that there will be a second naval military base in Gwadar, Pakistan, in addition to the Djibouti facility. So we have, in period of really since this greater Eurasia kind of concept has been out there, sort of details about 3 bilateral sort of security partnerships, right? China-Tajikistan, China-Pakistan, China-Afghanistan. Now, interestingly enough, there is an actual international organization that was also a regional security organization that was founded in 2016 called the Quadrilateral Cooperation Coordination Mechanism that joins together Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China. And I think one of the really interesting, and Russia and the US are of course excluded, one of the interesting declarations on its mission purpose from the Summit Declaration in 2016 is to coordinate with, support each other in a range of areas, including study and judgment of counterterrorism situation, confirmation of clues, intelligence sharing, anti-terrorist capability building, joint anti-terrorist training, and personal training. So for me, the framework justifying these Chinese activities is already there, right? And no matter how robust this cooperation actually is, the legal basis for a Chinese presence, I think, has been sort of set. So just to sort of sum up, the concept of a greater Eurasia underscores Central Asia's regional position within a number of these new emerging architectures, but far from settling the issue that now we're going to have Eurasian integration, I think it leaves a lot of open questions. Now, certainly there are some factors that are pushing towards Eurasian integration, and that's the good news side. So I think Sean Roberts will talk about changes in Uzbekistan today. That's certainly really important when we talk about actual connectivity in the region and so forth. But Greater Eurasia also really neglects the emerging social, political, geopolitical tensions that are unleashed by high-profile integration processes. And for me, China's growing regional influence are going to be rooted in the Belt and Road, its role as a creditor, and its new security footprint that are generated in the region. And it'll be interesting to see how Moscow reacts to this, right? Until now, the reaction has been, there's no daylight between us, we do different things, there's a division of labor. But again, how much are these sort of economic and Chinese security concerns going to translate into political influence, and is Moscow going to be okay with that? Thanks.